My name is Lila Archer, and 6 months ago, my father stood up at my wedding and made a promise everyone in that room believed. He said family was forever, and Archer loyalty meant nobody was left behind, not ever. I remember his words exactly the way you remember the last lines in a favorite book, not because you believe them, but because they ring in your head long after the story changes. My father, Richard Archer, was the kind of man people called sir even when they didn't have to. 59 years old, silver hair, CEO of the Archer Group, a name on high-rise buildings, hospital wings, and bronze plaques on the backs of benches nobody ever sat on. In our family, money was everywhere but rarely discussed, the kind of presence that lingers in the walls and in the spaces between words. And yet, when I chose to marry Eli, someone my father called nice but not Archer material, I knew, even as I walked down that aisle, that something in him was closing. There are things you feel long before they're spoken aloud, especially in families where love comes wrapped in expectations. Maybe I should have known when his wedding toast never mentioned my new last name. Maybe I should have noticed my mother squeezing my hand too tightly after. But I wanted, in that moment, to believe in the old promise of home, even as a small thread of dread began to coil around my nerves. Our wedding was held in the garden of the Archer family estate, the place I called home since I was a child. White columns, glossy green lawns, and a ballroom that smelled like polished wood and memory. The guest list was precisely curated: investors, family, friends, my old headmistress, half the people Eli and I actually cared about, and the other half people my father needed to impress. Everyone smiled wide for the cameras, but my father's smile was the wide, chilly type that photographs well and vanishes when the flash dies. After the cake was cut, after the first waltz and last call, after Eli carried me past the fountain and into a life I'd chosen, I thought for a moment I'd gotten away clean. I thought loyalty was a banked fire and forgiveness, a family value you could count on. For days after we returned from our short honeymoon, a coastal drive, cheap seafood, laughter that felt entirely outside of time, I found a letter on our doorstep. No return address, just Archer letterhead in the sharp, unmistakable slant of my father's pen. I took it inside, turning it over in my hands, hoping, idiotically, for a note that said, "Welcome home." Inside, Lila, as discussed prior, your personal accounts and cards linked to family funds have been suspended as of today, January 23rd. The trust is conditional. Choices have consequences. I am confident you understand my reasoning. Richard. That was it. 27 years distilled to 3 sentences. The attached statement showed every last line evaporating, ceased at his signature. When Eli came home that night, I had already called the bank, hope twisting like threadbare rope, knowing the answer, needing to hear it. They were polite. "Yes, Ms. Archer, the funds have been recalled. The trustee has acted within his legal rights under the arrangement." The arrangement. It sounded businesslike, clinical, not a thing you grew up eating birthday cake beside. Eli read my father's letter twice, quietly, then folded it into the envelope and set it on the table. "It's okay," he said. "We have enough." He was right, a little. We had his salary, my modest marketing job, a small nest egg I'd started in secret during college once I realized an Archer inheritance was more leash than lifeline. But the mortgage on our apartment came due each month with a new edge, and the car, the one my father had signed the paperwork for as a wedding gift, was technically leased under the company's name. I didn't cry. Some part of me wouldn't let tears have that much power. Instead, I started cataloging expenses, what would go, what we could keep, which dreams needed to be reboxed for another year, another life. I pared down hours at work, sold what jewelry I could part with. I gave up the gym, the book club that met at the hotel bar, the small, soft privileges I hadn't realized were privileges. It stung, losing those bits of comfort, but it was losing the sense of protection, the psychic safety net I'd grown up depending on, that gnawed at me worst. My mother called the morning after the first rent I paid with my own earnings. "Lila, darling, just checking in. How is married life?" Her voice was bright, a little too bright, and I heard not just worry but something else. Approval, maybe, or relief that she hadn't had to make the call herself. "Dad says you're learning independence. That's a good thing, really, for a young woman." I listened to her words, not for comfort but for clues, and heard her soften as she said, "You always were stronger than you thought. There is truth in hardship, or so people say. There's an honesty in learning what you can do when no one is there to smooth your path." Eli brought home pasta in brown bags and said we'd make a game of thrift, Joked we'd learn what real living felt like now. I watched the trustless balance on my app. Checked dollar menu specials, learned to budget like hope. The world quieted down around us, and the people who had called, texted, RSVP'd with gifts and promises all seemed to go silent, as if my family name was no longer a password worth typing. 6 weeks in, the first mail arrived redirecting bills. The car's lease, recall notice, returned to Archer Fleet within 80 hours or penalty. The dentist, once a friend of my father's, sent a bill with a new, unfamiliar total. The insurance agent who'd handled every policy since I was a toddler now asked, "Do you have proof of income for Cobra?" But we managed. We learned softness in the cracks. I spent nights at the kitchen table, learning how to stretch and mend, how to find comfort in a life measured differently. Love, I discovered, is best built in small rooms, in laughter over plain pasta, in the childhood quilt Eli's mother had given me on our wedding day. What I did not expect was that letting go of security would reveal something harder, and maybe better, in me. I started to look at every small thing I still owned, to hold each tiny survival as a medal earned, not gifted. I heard, for weeks, nothing from my father except the unmistakable silence of a door that closed very quietly and did not reopen. If this all sounds sad to you, it was. If it sounds freeing in the way falling sometimes frees you, that too. But it was not the end. 6 weeks turned into 3 months, and in the quiet, I started to see who kept returning calls, who still invited us over for coffee, and who faded into the same comfortable forgetfulness that came with losing your place in the family hierarchy. My old best friend Mara, who once boasted she'd be my maid of honor, now replied to texts with emojis and canceled brunch with the vague excuse of busy season. Even Eli's parents, sweet people from a much smaller world, seemed nervous around the cracks in our finances, offering home-cooked meals and used paperback novels as if that could fill a space once held by something harder and colder. Still, we found joy in small things. A picnic on the front steps, stargazing on our building's shaky rooftop, the occasional game night with a handful of people who decided love counted more than legacy. I spent late evenings dusting off old skills, reopening my freelance marketing account, chasing after contracts from small businesses, coffee shops, local florists, the kind of people who paid in praise and 2-week early checks. Every invoice cleared was a rung climbed back toward something that belonged to me, and Eli, patient as a tree, believed in my resilience more than I ever had. It became clear after a while that I did not miss being rich so much as I missed feeling seen. There is an invisibility in falling from grace. Rooms you expect to open for you don't. Faces that once brightened at your entrance now look through you at the next best thing. My father's circle hummed with polite silence. I heard, through the grapevine, that his office Christmas party was smaller this year, that someone else's daughter was named the future of Archer Group, that his assistant had updated the family portraits in the main hallway with a photo set that stopped 1 year short of my wedding. But sometimes loss frees up space for things you never saw coming. My brother, Sam, who had always played the part of the easygoing youngest, started texting more. He would send memes, check in about Eli's job hunt, or drop the odd "you guys eating okay?" Like he was practicing for some new role in a different family story. One cold Wednesday, he showed up at our apartment with 2 bags of groceries and a shy sort of pride, saying, "Can you imagine I figured out coupons?" We laughed, and for the first time in our grown-up lives, there was no measurement, no Archer yardstick, no silent scoreboard ticking off favored and disappointing children. In that small kitchen with the heat rattling furiously in the pipes, I learned that sometimes, when you step out from under a shadow, you find sunlight sneaking around the edges. Another surprise came from a source I never would have predicted. Mrs. Parson, our elderly neighbor, crocheted a lumpy, brightly colored afghan and left it at our door with the note, "New lives need warm beginnings. Keep going." I don't know if she meant our marriage, our journey, or just the obvious truth that January in the city was cold and sometimes hope needed help. I wrapped the afghan around me for comfort on nights I couldn't sleep, pretending it was a shield against the world's new indifference. The hardest moments were the ones when letters came addressed to Ms. Archer, but bore no real message, reminders from the bank, statements with evaporated balances, notices that served only to remind me what had changed and who had closed the door. There were sharper reminders too. My cousin Heather, who had always been a relentless climber, posted a photo of her with my father at a gala, captioned, "Nothing like an Archer hand to help you up." I recognized the ring on his finger, The one my mother had always said was a signet passed down from generation to generation. In the background, the family home glowing golden, its windows lit for guests I no longer had a claim to. I studied the photo for a long time, wondering whether I was simply dreaming a loss or waking up to the truth of who my family had always been. A truth that had survived beneath the silk and laughter and seaside portraits. More than once I wondered if I should call my father, if the weight of pride was worth the price we were paying, but pride is sticky. It covers you in stubbornness, convinces you that silence is safer than new wounds. Eli never pushed me. He simply lived side by side with the daily effort, lifting what he could, carrying me through the worst days with gentle humor and quiet faith. There's a form of love that blooms in adversity, patient and steady, like moss on stone. Ours grew in the cracks, watered by necessity and little dreams. 3 months in, I finally found a steady freelance client. A small publishing startup run by an editor who cared more about my work than my last name. For the first time since the cutoff, I felt the faintest sense of self being built again, dollar by hard-earned dollar. Nights lost their bitterness, replaced by the color of possibility, if not actual comfort. Sometimes when Eli would fall asleep before me, I'd sit at the foot of our bed and stare out over the city, its thousands of little lights burning stubbornly. I remembered a lesson from childhood. A thing my grandmother Archer said before she died. Rich is having options, darling. But wealth is having someone in your corner when you run out. I didn't know it then, but that line would anchor me later. On our 6-month anniversary, Eli brought home a cupcake with a sparkler and joked, "Try not to set off the fire alarm, this place can't afford it." And we ate it cross-legged on the worn carpet, laughing at how small celebrations get when the world shrinks to its essentials. I didn't know the world was about to shift again. Or that loss sometimes clears ground for something you never asked for. Something harder and more honest than the fairy tale you started out wanting. It was late March when the first real sign of my father's world colliding back into mine arrived, not as a demand or invitation, but as a shadow subtle, almost easy to miss if I hadn't learned to read between every line that carried the Archer seal. I found the letter propped on our doormat after a long walk. The sort that Eli and I had come to take when cabin fever crept up with the gray of city spring. Neither of us sang much except to wonder aloud if daffodils were strong enough to break through frost. The envelope was thick, heavier than the standard formal kind, and my name was handwritten on the front in a pen I recognized from years of piano recitals and birthday cards. I opened it at the kitchen table, heart thrumming not from hope but from the wary anticipation that comes when you've gone too long without contact and know all too well what family outreach usually costs. Inside was a short note in my father's formal, clipped style. "Lila, there will be a foundation event at the house April 10th. It will be in aid of the Children's Hospital. Your mother and I would like you to attend. Dress code formal. RSVP with Ms. Doyle by Friday." That was all, no apology, no explanation. No acknowledgement of months of silence, but an instruction and a summons, in the language of Archer logistics. I stared at it. After so much silence, the event felt less like a branch of peace and more like a return to duty. The daughter now needed for optics, not affection. Eli let me decide, offering nothing but his arm at my side when I finally said, "Let's just go," nod politely, and leave before dessert. We both knew what it meant. Crossing the threshold of my parents' world as outsiders, as observers, no longer wrapped in the false security of hereditary belonging. The weekend before the gala, I walked into a thrift shop on impulse, fingers searching for something formal enough but not overconfident, wanting to send the message even if only to myself that I still belonged, but on my own terms now. I found a navy dress, simple with a small snag in the hem, and thought as I purchased it, "There's power in needing nothing from a room like that." On the drive to the estate, my stomach twisted with a child's old nervousness. The house stood unchanged, its windows ablaze with light, cars lining the drive, the scent of freshly cut grass and cologne wafting through the air. We walked up the marble steps together, Eli's hand steady at my back, and entered to the polite hush that follows new arrivals. If anyone noticed I was slimmer, or that my shoes didn't gleam, they didn't say. Only my mother, coming over with rehearsed warmth and a glass of champagne, smiled as though nothing had happened. "Lila, darling," she said, as practiced as ever. "You look radiant. We've missed you at the house." It was an act, all of it, her tight hug and air kiss, the inclusion of Eli with a practiced, "How's work? You must miss Lila at the office." I played along, matching politeness for politeness. Dad was working the room, a chess master in a dark suit whose eyes landed on us now and again, not unkind, just assessing. For almost an hour, we drifted around small knots of conversation. I felt all the old vigilance returning. The way be good, be presentable, be impressive had been stitched into my Arctic skin since forever. Near the piano I found Sam balancing a tray of canapés and a bored expression, grabbing my hand with relief. "You came," he said, grinning. "Mom had bets you wouldn't." "I'm still technically family until my badge is revoked," I whispered back. We smiled at our private joke, until my father summoned me with a gesture from across the room. The summons of the CEO, not the invitation of a dad. What followed was a performance. He pulled me into the group of donors and dignitaries, speaking of the Archer commitment to the city's future, using words like legacy and responsibility in sentences that made me, for just a moment, feel like a silhouette filled in by someone else's pen. I was his example, his talking point, not fully a daughter anymore but a name with facial features, useful for showing how Archer values pass down generations. I smiled where necessary and stood where told, and all the while Eli kept to the edges, present but silent, unseen but solid. Afterward my father pulled me aside, into the study where I'd once practiced spelling lists and learned, at 7, that Archer children shake hands with dinner guests. He closed the door and turned to me, jaw set but not with anger, something closer to disappointment, maybe regret if regret could be cold. "I see you've managed," he said. "I wouldn't have chosen this for you, but one does what one must after making a choice." I stared at his hands, noticing, absent-mindedly, that they trembled when he adjusted his cufflinks. "Did you invite me here to say that, or just for the donors?" He didn't answer that, not directly. "There's a place for you if you want it. If circumstances have changed." He waited, the next move laid before me. But I shook my head, forcing evenness into my voice. "I wish you just said you missed me. It would have been simpler." He didn't blink, didn't smile, just nodded once, and the silence lengthened between us until I excused myself. All evening that interaction darted in my chest like a splinter. On the drive home, Eli was the first to break our mutual silence. "They're feeling something," he said. "Things must not be as steady as they look." I shrugged, not wanting to hope, but unable to shake the feeling that under all that steel and glass, the Archer house was shaking, even if the world outside couldn't hear it yet. April blurred into May, and with it came quiet rumors from old acquaintances and the occasional headline that did not scream but hinted. Archer Group faces uncertain quarter. CEO's family business feels market strain. I saw them on the commute, flickering on financial news tickers in the deli, or along the bottom of my phone screen when I scrolled between client emails. I didn't tell Eli right away, but we both learned, somewhere in the months of scraping by, not to hide worry for the other's sake. Instead, our conversations grew honest. If things ever got harder, we would face it together, one day, one bill, one hope at a time. I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that I did not ache for a return to luxury, but for a chance to prove, if only to myself, that my life no longer depended on my father's seasons or storms. Our world had gotten smaller, but it shone in unexpected ways. Friday nights became sacred, cheap wine and half-price takeout. Talks about dreams that had nothing to do with companies or legacies. I had started saving every freelance dollar I could, building a secret account, not for safety but for pride, the fragile, stubborn hope of starting something truly my own. It was in this season of fragile hope that the next upheaval arrived, not in the form of my family but in the form of an email, as so much of life does now. The publishing startup, the one that had given me steady work, was planning a major citywide book festival, and they wanted me to run the entire digital campaign. If I could succeed, a permanent marketing position would be mine, salary and all, with the chance to grow into a partner. I took the job with a trembling kind of joy, scared and exhilarated at once. I spent nights with spreadsheets and drafts, mornings on calls, afternoons walking the city to meet small business sponsors, my feet aching but my heart beginning, very quietly, to heal. When the campaign launched and the first week's numbers soared, my boss called me not by my last name, but by Lila. "You did it." I felt something lift inside me that no trust fund could have offered. The City Book Festival was a clear, tangible success. On the final day, as crowds buzzed through the tents and authors signed in lines that snaked down sidewalks, I felt the itch of eyes and turned to see Sam waving from a distance, a proud, awkward smile on his face. "Needed to see this," he said. "And hey, I told Mom. She'll pretend she's not, but she's proud too." That night, exhausted but glowing, I walked home with Eli, both of us high on fresh air, and the rare feeling of having done something that belonged entirely to us. My phone buzzed, and when I looked, I saw an unknown number, my father. For a moment I didn't answer, but Eli squeezed my hand and I took the call, stepping into a quiet side street. "Congratulations," he said. It was not warm, but there was a trace of something I'd never heard before. Hesitation, uncertainty, maybe a remnant of pride. "Sam sent me a news article. You've made a name for yourself." I stood on the curb, searching for the right reply, finally settling on, "It helps when the name is your own." Silence. Then slowly he asked, "Are you happy?" It sounded like he was reading the question off a page for the first time. "Yes," I said. "Happier than I can remember." Another pause. "There's going to be a board meeting next week. Some changes are coming. If you're offered a seat, would you consider it?" The question landed in the space between us, tempting and terrifying at once. But the truth was, for the first time, I wasn't sure I needed a seat at his table to feel whole. That realization felt like both a door and a window opening at once, possibility and escape both in view. When I hung up and joined Eli, I told him the news, working through the feelings, pride, fear, confusion, like sorting through old keepsakes for the few you still want to keep. As the week wore on, my nervousness grew. But by the morning of the board meeting, I found myself with more strength than anxiety. That afternoon I entered the Archer Group's glass building, not as a daughter looking for approval, but as a professional called to the table for her own work. The boardroom was cold and full of familiar faces that looked at me with a new combination of calculation and curiosity. My father introduced me as Miss Archer, a proven leader in her own right, and I read, in the slight softening of his mouth, the rarest sign of respect. When the chairman offered me a seat, conditional on my own terms, I smiled and said, "Thank you, but I'd like to build something of my own now. What I bring here is not family but value. If you want that, I'm open to talk as a partner, never as a beneficiary." There was a brief, shocked silence, then a slow, decisive nod from my father. "Understood." I walked out into the sunlight with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. At home, I told Eli, and instead of regret, we celebrated, quiet and real. The tiny victory of knowing my life was no longer something that could be signed away in a boardroom or revoked by a parent's pride. That week, Sam texted, "Proud of you, sis." And for the first time since the cutoff, I believed I might actually be proud of myself too. 6 months to the day after the wedding, almost down to the hour, a detail I would only recognize looking back. I woke up before sunrise, the city outside still quiet and unsure in the blue haze between night and morning. I lay beside Eli, listening to his breathing and thinking about how ordinary life had become and how precious the smallest ordinariness felt. The sunlight pooling on our thrift store table, the mug with a chipped lip, the worn patch in the carpet where we sat laughing about bills, letting problems find their proportion. There was no magic hour, no abrupt return, but the world glowed inch by stubborn inch, with a sense of having rebuilt something I owned completely. That morning an envelope arrived by courier. Not the kind on Archer letterhead, but an invitation embossed in gold, the CEO's charity auction, a citywide event known for its opulence and glare. I didn't feel small reading it. I dressed with more deliberation than anxiety, wearing the navy dress, still freshly pressed, hem mended with the awkward honesty of someone learning to live by her own hands. When we stepped into the hotel ballroom, the echoes of orchestral music and the soft roar of laughter, the flicker of lights on glass, I could feel the eyes, but this time it didn't make me shrink. People greeted us differently now. Not with empty congratulations that ring hollow, but with quick, sincere nods, handshakes that lingered as if something of what I'd weathered had traveled ahead of me, invisible but real. My mother hovered at the door, her face caught between relief and something like regret. She drew me close, whispered, "You did well, Lila. I see that now," but didn't linger to elaborate, as if admitting more might cost her something. My father was across the hall, a fixture still in his world, nodding to donors, easy among the powerful, but when he saw me he stopped, his smile dipping just for a moment. He made his way over, hands in his pockets, a stance I recognized from childhood. reserved for moments when words were harder to find. "Walk with me," he asked. We crossed through the crowd as two people finding their place in an unfamiliar play written by time and pride. He didn't talk about business or reputation. Instead, standing at the edge of the dance floor, he said softly, "I did what I thought was right. I thought I was teaching you to stand on your own. Maybe I was afraid that if I gave too much, you'd never know how strong you are." His voice was not the voice of the boardroom or the big speech. It was uncertain, flawed, almost human. I swallowed the old urge to say what would keep peace and instead spoke the truth that months of hardship had chiseled out of me. "You wanted me to be strong, Dad, but you also wanted me to be grateful for things I never asked for." He nodded, looking over the stirring crowd. People who'd known the weight of both power and isolation. "This world eats its own if you let it. I never wanted that for you. But you cut me off," I said. "I didn't just learn to swim. I almost drowned." His shoulders fell then, a real gesture. "That was wrong of me." The moment passed between us, sharp but cleansing, and I realized forgiveness was not owed but possible, and only as far as I carried it. "We can try," I said. "But if we start over, it's as people, not positions." He nodded, understanding, and I felt a release of something old, as if the last rope between love and duty had finally frayed. The auction night shimmered on, crystal and chatter blending together. But I stood taller, Eli's arm looped around me, my brother toasting with a grin from the crowd. Everyone who mattered in my new, smaller universe found me by midnight, not because I'd won back a place at the family table, but because I'd made a place for myself that would never be subject to someone else's accounting. When we walked home, heels dangling from my hands, Eli's laugh echoing in the dark, I realized I had learned to admire the world less for its gifts and more for what it lets you build out of what you're left with. Months of loss had carved a kind of gratitude into me, not for comfort, but for the proof that no one can close every door if you're brave enough to build a window. I answered the final insurance letter myself, negotiated rates, marketed 3 small businesses before lunch the next day. Life felt unglamorous and honest. On weekends, I cooked for Sam, who never stopped bringing discount groceries, and we joked about who would invent the next family tradition now that the old ones were mothballed. I let myself dream, quietly, stubbornly, of opening my own small firm, built not on the Archer name but on the discipline I'd earned through weather, not inheritance. Some nights I caught my father's number on my phone and would answer if I felt strong enough. Sometimes we talked for 5 minutes, sometimes for 50, sometimes just about the weather. No one ever said, "I'm sorry," the way we wanted, but the apology lived in the work, in the effort to call, to stay, to try. 6 months after the wedding, I stood in the half-dark of our apartment, tracing the view from the window, and realized that the fairy tale that ended wasn't a tragedy, only a prologue. The real inheritance had nothing to do with trust funds or glossy last names. It was this: the knowledge of what to refuse, the strength to resist what cost too much of your self-worth, and the certainty that happiness, when earned, is a quieter, tougher thing than the world's applause. If you're listening tonight and know what it's like to lose your place at the comfortable table, know you're in good company. Sometimes everything you think you've lost is only the clearing of a new field, waiting for what you'll plant, for the home you'll build with your own 2 hands. This is what 6 months taught me: that surviving being cut off is only the beginning. Living well is the rest.